Thanks, Scott. So I think we have a great first session. I'm sure all of these papers will do well in the future. The focus is M&A and regulation. I'm going to sort of just get on with it really, but just to remind people that it is 20 minutes for the presentation, 15 for discussion, and 10 for Q&A. I'm going to be sat down here with an iPad showing the time. So, Tom, would you please come up and present the regulatory exposure for M&A synergies?
I hope so. Not convinced, though. There we go. All right, on the clock. Thank you so much for the organizers for having my paper on the program. It's joined with Eli Fich and Joseph Kalmenovitz. I normally move around a lot when I present, but that doesn't seem wise on this stage, so I'm going to stay here for now. But the type of paper is, does regulatory exposure create M&A synergies? And though that's the direct research question that we're trying to answer, I would like to take a step back and think kind of big picture motivation. The big picture question that we would like to contribute to but can't fully answer is, how does regulation shape economic activity and the organization of economic activity? So U.S. firms have complied with over 35,000 federal regulations set by 347 agencies. And they span from financial reporting to labor, product safety and labeling, advertisement, environment. And the SEC estimates that firms spend about 14.2 million hours per year dealing with the Form 10K requirements alone. Right. So over time, there's been a growing regulatory regime, and there's been a lot of economic thought and legal thought about how this regulation shapes our economy and the welfare effects. And there are two broad camps. One camp is the public interest theory, that these are welfare increasing rules that are correcting market failure. The other hand is the regulatory capture camp that believes that a lot of these rules are self-interested, large firms and politicians going back and forth to benefit incumbents at the public's expense. Yet, despite the importance of this topic, there's been little research in a systematic empirical manner on the topic. Instead, a lot of our empirical research, due to our methods, have been on specific rules one at a time, difference and differences. So our contribution is to start off with a novel measure of firm-specific regulatory exposure to all federal regulations. Right? So what we're going to do is create an index of active federal regulations and create a regulatory beta, if you will, that shows the stock-implied exposure to the change in the number of regulations. And then we're going to assess how these regulatory shocks influence the organization of economic activity in the environment. And we find that M&A activity increases after these shifts in federal regulation, particularly for private targets and small targets that might not be able to bear these regulatory costs. And then finally, we're going to take a look at the welfare implications, at least from the acquirer's perspective, and we find that these acquisitions made by highly regulated acquirers tend to be associated with significantly higher abnormal returns. So our overall takeaway is that firms react to high regulatory compliance costs by optimally increasing their scales through M&A, and that's consistent with the neoclassical theory of M&A. All right, so to start off, Joseph really deserves the most credit for this aspect of the paper. He's a phenomenal young scholar. If you're not familiar with his work, he focuses on the economics of regulation. And really for the last 7 or so years, he's been in the trove of government websites scraping data. So it all started in 1980 with the Federal Paperwork Reduction Act, when the U.S. government realized maybe our regulatory burden is too onerous, we should start tracking this stuff. So the OMB and OIRA are tasked with monitoring this regulation, and they have internal reviews on Form 83Is. So we go in there and we scrape those internal reviews. It's around 167,000 forms. And from those reviews, we collect individual active regulation using OMB-controlled numbers, the Office of Management and Budget. And together, we're going to use these active regulations and create an index in the spirit of Baker, Bloom, and Davis, who had that economic policy uncertainty index based on word counts in the news. So together, we're going to create a regulatory intensity index that captures the number of active federal regulations between 1981 and 2018. The pattern follows what you might expect. There has been an increase in the regulatory regime in the US, a number of active federal regulations, but it does peak and trough through political and economic events. So as you can see, in the 1980s, there was a drop in regulation. During the Reagan administration, in the early 2000s, there was an enormous jump in regulation to do with Homeland Security and also the Sarbanes-Oxley Act. Around 2010, the introduction of the Dodd-Frank bill and CFPB increased regulation until more recently, during the Trump administration, regulation decreased. And while that aggregate index is informative and useful, similar to how the Laporta, Schleifer, and Vishney count of institutional protections, that sort of index is useful, we wanted to go one step further, and we wanted to create a firm-specific measure. So we take this aggregate regulatory index, and we try to extract unanticipated regulatory changes from second-order autoregression. So we're essentially demeaning it, and we're trying to pull out unanticipated shifts in regulation. And then we're going to calculate the stock-implied exposure to those regulatory shifts, right? So essentially, we're creating a regulatory beta by regressing the excess return over the risk-free rate on those regulatory shifts and the Fromm-French risk factors. And we're going to come up with a new measure of regulatory exposure that essentially is capturing the sensitivity of the stock to these regulatory innovations. And the nice part about this is that as an empirical researcher, we don't have to sit there and pick and choose what regulations we think might be important for a specific industry. We also don't have to worry about firms that operate across multiple industries with different regulatory agencies or across different geographical jurisdictions. Instead, we're letting investors tell us which regulations are important for which firms, right? So now that we have our regulatory beta measure, we're going to think about how should this or how could this be associated with M&A activity in the US. And we start off, and I apologize to our discussant, in the paper as it's currently constituted, we focus primarily on this point number one here, that changes in regulation create a tremendous amount of uncertainty, and there's a well-established economic literature that shows uncertainty increases the value to delay investment and therefore reduces investment. So the same way that, as you'll see next paper, antitrust enforcement might reduce M&A activity, or economic policy uncertainty or valuation uncertainty might reduce M&A activity. We thought at first, at least our priors, was that this increase in regulation would create an uncertainty that would lower M&A activity. Beyond that, what would that uncertainty be about? Well, how much will it take for each firm to comply with these regulations? So there could be a resource diversion, capital and effort that would have been used for investment now is going to be spent on regulatory compliance. And also, there is a notion of successor liability. So when a company acquires a target, they're actually responsible for any regulatory transgressions that happened before the sale. So Mondelez, or Kraft at the time, had a hostile takeover at Cadbury in 2010, and they actually had to pay a fine in 2017 for FCPA violations that happened way back in the earlier 2000s. And the SEC has a precedent of charging companies for a failure to comply with this so-called regulatory due diligence, right? So our prior was that, increasing regulation increases regulatory uncertainty and risk, and therefore we would expect a decrease in M&A activity. However, we proposed a regulatory synergy hypothesis, just in the spirit of the neoclassical model of M&A, right? So firms use M&A according to neoclassical theory as an optimal response to changes in investment opportunity and cost structure. These regulations present a huge change in both their cost structure in terms of compliance costs and their competitive landscape. right? So two quotes that I really enjoyed. One is from an energy M&A survey of energy executives recently by CMS Law. And the quote was, regulatory changes are cited as a blocker of deal activity by only 10% of respondents. Rather than being an obstacle, regulatory changes are in fact the reason why many deals are done in the first place. If you just Google the race to net zero in environmental regulation and deal activity, a lot of this shows up. Firms are actively seeking to divest dirty assets or buy cleaner assets. So this regulatory change environmentally could perhaps be a reason or motivation for M&A. Similar regulatory changes were selected as the most important driver impacted M&A. 57% of respondents said that it was likely their bank would be involved in M&A in the next 2 years. This is after the creation of the CFPB and Dodd-Frank Act. And then finally, a third reason that we believe the regulatory synergy hypothesis might hold is that we would see this be particularly important for small deals, private companies that are financially constrained that aren't able to overcome this regulatory burden. One final quote is from the S&P Global Market Intelligence Survey in 2017. I can emphatically state if significant regulatory relief is not provided for small and mid-sized institutions soon, in 20 years, I doubt we'll have any left with anything else besides mega banks. All right, so our goal is to take our regulatory data measure and examine how it affects M&A activity. But of course, the empirical challenge is that this measure of regulatory exposure could be correlated with industry or macroeconomic factors. All right, we're going to lean heavily on just our construction of our firm-specific measure. So for example, the Dodd-Frank Act in introduction to CFPB, that increases the regulatory index on aggregate for all firms, but it has a particularly biting impact on banks, but not all banks are treated equally. So for example, our highest value of regulatory data is in the year 2011, and it's Capital One, because the truth in lending aspects of those regulations were particularly onerous, where they'd be less onerous for an investment bank. Similarly, our second highest reg data firm is Hub Transportation. In 2016, they were dealing with environmental regulations and immigration restrictions that was crucial for their workforce. So we think that this first firm-specific measure helps us avoid a lot of this macroeconomic and industry-level shocks. But on top of that, we're going to control for the classic acquired controls, such as size, ROA, leverage, market to book, and prior stock return, and then industry controls. So our view of regulation is we're thinking about firms' incentive to merge, to overcome regulation, or to adapt to regulation. It's very different from the old kind of Mitchell and Mulherin or Harvard 2005 industry deregulation indicator variable, which is more about the ability of firms to go and make a merger, right? They're restrained from mergers. So we control for that, and we also control for the Harvard 2005 industry economic shocks. And finally, we control for funding conditions and other measures of uncertainty, whether it be macro uncertainty or the Baker-Bloom economic policy uncertainty. Turning to the findings, we find that our regulatory exposure variable is strongly and positively associated with deal activity, both using an indicator variable if the firm makes an acquisition during a quarter, and using log 1 plus deal value during that firm quarter. Whether we layer in industry and macro controls or industry and year fixed effects, the economic magnitude, one standard deviation increase in regulatory exposure is associated with a 2.7% increase in acquisition likelihood. For comparison, if you think about those key variables from Harvard 2005, when we have them in this regression, the rate spread, so funding conditions, one standard deviation change in rate spread is associated with a 1.6% increase or decrease in acquisition activity, and economic shock policy variable is associated with about a 5% change in acquisition likelihood. Turning to the deal quality, so when there's a shift in regulation, firms are responding by growing larger, right, by merging and changing their operations, and the market views these as a positive development, kind of an optimal response to regulation. So on average, we find that a 1 standard deviation increase in regulatory exposure is associated with 21 basis points higher cumulative abnormal returns for the acquirer, which is around $20 million market cap for the average acquirer. And again, this sort of economic magnitude is in line with prior results, again, with funding conditions. So far we find that shifts in regulatory exposures lead to more and better deals, but we want to link it towards our regulatory synergy hypothesis. So thinking through neoclassical theory, the results should be strongest for the firms that have the greatest incentives to merge. And those, we believe, would be the smaller deals or private targets that don't have the ability to cope with that fixed cost of regulation. Thank you. And once again, we find that deal activity is in fact concentrated among these small private targets, and that acquired cars are highest for these deals involving small or private targets. So the estimates are significantly higher. For example, high regulatory exposure acquirers are earning 77 basis points higher cars for these particular deals. Our interpretation is that small private companies may not be able to efficiently absorb regulatory compliance costs and use the M&A as an opportunity to increase their economies of scale. Next, we try to pin down the source of the value creation, and we're going to go about that in 3 ways. At the firm quarter level, if you just have a panel regression with your regulatory exposure variable on the right side and some measure of firm performance on the left side, whether that's stock performance or accounting performance, we find a strong negative correlation. But if you split the sample and consider firms that have completed a recent acquisition, that mitigates that effect. So regulatory exposure is costly, but acquisitions might be able to mitigate that cost because they're growing their scale and perhaps their expertise. So a notable finding beyond that is that after completing an acquisition, firms exhibit a decrease in their stock price sensitivity to future regulation. So as I grow larger, as I hire more lawyers probably and increase my regulatory expertise, the next regulatory shift has a smaller effect on my firm. There's a smaller stock price reaction. And then finally, at the deal level, as I mentioned, a lot of our targets are private, which makes measuring synergies at the deal level significantly more difficult, but we do find a positive association between the acquirer's regulatory exposure and measures of deal synergies. So overall, we believe regulatory exposure is costly for firms, but M&A is a great way for firms to develop the scale and expertise to mitigate the costs. Overall, to conclude, our paper develops a novel measure of regulatory exposure based on a stock's co-movement with shifts in federal regulation, so a regulatory beta. And we find that these highly exposed firms are more likely to engage in M&A activities. So these regulatory changes have a big effect on the organization of economic activity in the U.S., right? Second, this reorganization of economic activity appears to be beneficial, at least from the acquirer's perspective, right? So highly exposed acquirers earn higher cars, experience better long-run operating performance, and then experience a drop in their sensitivity to future regulations. But circling back to our start, thinking about public interest or regulatory capture theory of regulation, what's sort of the big picture? Regulation does affect the organization of economic activity. It does seem beneficial for acquirers, but we really can't say anything overall about welfare effects because a lot of commenters, researchers, policymakers are concerned about the concentration in the U.S. economy, right? Winner take all, large firms are growing larger. Well, this plays right into it. The more regulation that is implemented, the more it is advantageous for large firms to grow even larger, and that could hamper economic innovation and employment. So one final note that I would like to make before closing is that our results highlight that regulatory exposure and regulatory uncertainty are distinct constructs. Uncertainty lowers the likelihood of making an acquisition, where exposure might make you optimally change your scope in a neoclassical sense. I had to add that last bullet just for this presentation, given our second paper that's coming up next. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tom. Perfect timing. The discussant is Ronald Masulis, who's on his way up. Ron, do you have your slides up here already? Yeah. I'll let you find your slides. I'll leave it to you. You have 15 minutes.
Thank you very much. Okay, I'd like to thank the organizers for inviting me to discuss this interesting new paper. Let me start by just reviewing what the basic objective and the approach is very briefly. They are studying the impact of U.S. federal government regulations on the profitability of U.S. acquisitions by publicly held acquirers. And they use a new measure of regulatory exposure, which is, I think, the most important innovation here, to assess whether acquisition profitability and frequency are influenced either positively, negatively, or not at all by government regulations. And the basic approach is to regress acquisition activity levels and performance on measures of stock regulatory exposure. Now, basic data issues very quickly. U.S. government regulations is a focus. The time period is 1986 through 2018, so it's a pretty long 33-year sample period. Profitability of U.S. acquisitions is measured by a standard 3-day initial announcement CAR for the acquirer. Focuses on publicly held acquirer returns, although the targets can be public, private, or subsidiaries. Regulatory index is based on quarterly number of regulations scaled by the regulatory body's overall regulatory activity and the changes in it. Okay, main results, greater regulatory exposure of acquirers measured by sensitivity of stock returns to the regulatory index changes, increases acquisition synergies realized by the acquirer. So it's, again, measured by announcement returns. Firms facing more regulatory exposure earn higher M&A announcement returns. They make more acquisition bids. They invest more in these acquisitions. Now, a key question is, does the subsample of firms with high regulatory exposure significantly differ from the major economic dimensions from firms with lower regulatory exposure? For example, could these differences in regulatory exposure be proxying for something like acquirer size or its level of diversification? I think it's an important question to explore. The other major results in the paper are that acquisitions of private firms and smaller targets are more profitable for firms with greater regulatory exposure. I think an important question is, why not compare deals with similar targets but having acquirers with more versus less regulatory exposure? So comparing private targets with acquirers of these two different categories. Is there a significant difference in deal profitability for this alternative comparison? I think this is a very relevant question, since we already know that acquisitions by private firms tend to be more profitable for acquirers. As for the smaller acquisitions, the results there, I'm wondering whether these are proxying to some degree for acquisitions of subsidiaries, which again, we have some evidence that they tend to be more profitable than acquisitions of public companies. Exploring the long-term abnormal stock returns and the long-term accounting returns, the study finds that these long-term returns are positively related to regulatory exposure. It also finds a positive association to several synergy proxies based on accounting multiples. And then post-acquisition, firms with high regulatory exposure experience a significant decline in their exposure, again measured by that sensitivity of abnormal stock returns to changes in the regulatory index. Now the question is this significantly different from acquirers with lower regulatory exposure? The decline in regulatory exposure is greater for deals involving private targets and small targets. And so I think, again, there's, scope for further analysis as to why that might be true. I'd encourage the authors to consider expanding the horizon that they look at, which is, I think, just looking at 1 year beyond post-acquisition. I also wonder whether this could be capturing to some degree a regression to the mean type effect. Question, does it make sense that deals with small targets should lead to large declines in regulatory exposure? Economically, that strikes me as hard to understand, because the importance of that transaction to the acquirer is going to be relatively small. So why would we expect to see it have a large impact? The study argues that this reflects acquirers being able to diversify away regulatory exposure through acquisitions. But it would be nice to see more direct evidence on this claim. Now, there are two basic hypotheses that the study is entertaining. The traditional hypothesis is that regulations can reduce profitability of acquisitions. The new hypothesis here is that regulations actually enhance profitability of acquisitions via this regulatory synergy hypothesis. I think that needs to be more fully developed, but let me suggest that there are other possible hypotheses that could be considered. One is regulations can create barriers to entry that benefit existing firms, making the acquisitions more expensive but potentially more profitable given greater market power. Thus, increases in regulation could benefit existing firms by reducing competition through less entry. Now, this argument could also be reinforced by a second argument or hypothesis, which is that if regulations have a significant fixed component associated with them, then when two firms in the same economic environment, say the same industry, combine, then there should be a larger regulatory savings, as there's only going to be one fixed cost borne afterwards, not two. And furthermore, that fixed cost should be scaled across a much larger asset base or sales base. Now, let me talk a little more about the regulatory synergies hypothesis. What I'd like to know is, what are the economic mechanisms that underlie this hypothesis? Are some synergies due to, one, a learning model of regulatory capture, maybe? Or two, due to scale economies from developing regulatory or lobbying expertise? However, why should an acquisition necessarily be needed to realize these benefits? To develop scale economies, especially for small deals? Not sure. To create regulatory or political expertise? Again, it seems like, are you really incrementally adding much by doing that? Do these economic mechanisms apply equally to within industry versus diversifying deals? I'd expect they would be much more important in intra-industry deals. So maybe an interaction term between regulatory exposure and an inter-industry deal might be. Okay, so the basic approach is to create unexpected quarterly changes in aggregate numbers of regulations based on a second-order autoregression model of the level of regulation. This is based on scaling all the regulations for a single agency or government body to have a zero mean and a unit standard deviation. And then sum these standardized values across all the regulatory bodies. Then you regress this unexpected change in this regulation index by monthly abnormal stock returns based on a 4-factor from the French model. For the same time period, and from this you can obtain the stock's individual sensitivity to regulation. Estimates are based on a 24-month rolling window, and stock return sensitivity is then used as your measure of regulatory exposure. I've got several major concerns with this index. First, the number of regulations is not equivalent to the dollar cost of the regulation, yet the study would assert otherwise. I think it needs to offer some more direct evidence. Is the change in the aggregate cost of regulation actually positively correlated with the change in the number of regulations? Again, I think some evidence is needed. There are also no validity checks to justify that the use of stock return sensitivity to these changes in the index are a good measure of regulatory exposure. A couple of possible tests. You might look to see if heavily regulated firms have higher sensitivity. You might also do some event study analysis where there are major changes, either increases or decreases in regulations, and see how that affects the regulatory index that is being calculated and in the stock return sensitivity. Also, since changes in the number of regulations are only quarterly, it seems that you might be more appropriate to aggregate up the monthly stock returns to a quarterly basis as well. And then that makes the rolling 24-month estimation period actually a rolling 8-quarter estimation period. Some other concerns with the index: why are all the regulations of each agency scaled to a zero mean and a unit standard deviation? Scaling each agency regulation by the time series standard deviation strikes me as problematic on several dimensions. First, the number of regulations is likely to be highly skewed. Second, the regulatory bodies with the fewest changes in regulations are likely to have the smallest standard deviation. And this means that the scaling to a unit standard deviation, they're going to be overweighted relative to other agencies where there's a lot more regulatory activity, which will be underweighted. And third, why not at least aggregate together all the regulations of the smallest and least active regulatory bodies to see if that changes the index values. Some other suggestions and comments. Is the sensitivity of the abnormal stock returns to changes in this aggregate regulatory index the best way to measure regulatory exposure? What about also including creating an industry regulatory index to capture the more important industry-related changes as an additional measure of exposure? Why not also examine whether the target has regulatory exposure? In the analysis currently, it's focusing just on the acquirer. Since I'm running out of time, I'm going to also just mention a couple other things. For deals with public targets, why not also examine deal profitability using a weighted average of the returns of both the target and the acquirer? Likewise, the same thing could be done to look at what happens to post-acquisition regulatory exposure. You could adjust for acquirers diversified over a large number of industries, they're likely to face a lot more regulatory exposure and changes in that exposure. So I think that's worth doing some additional analysis on. It also would be interesting or useful to control for some other important determinants of acquisitions, such as the number of industries subject to some substantial changes in competition, maybe due to tariff reductions. I think the relative size of the deal is very important, since it's likely to have the most impact on the acquirer. The predictability of bid announcements should negatively affect the size of acquirers' announcement returns. So some control for predictability could be useful. I've got some suggestions on that. And private firms are likely to be exempt from many regulatory burdens. So I think a control for this type of target, maybe some interactions with regulatory exposure may be appropriate. And then some robustness analysis for periods that exclude periods with significant economic downturns that are in this sample period probably would be worth doing. So just final thoughts. It's an ambitious study, addresses an important topic, uses a very new index of regulatory exposure as its main lens for analyzing regulatory effects. And thus, I think it's very important that the evidence on the validity and the reliability of this index be provided. And it's also important, I think, to show that firms that rank high or low in this regulatory index don't have very important other economic differences that need to be controlled for. Thanks.
Thanks, Ron.
Sorry, just clip that on just for the, just something you can stick it. Just, you stick it inside the pocket. Just clip it on the side.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Okay, so thanks, Ron. I think that was a great discussion. I especially like the parts relating to the theory of thermal regulation, also the index measurement. I don't know how we want to do this. Do you want to provide a quick response first, Tom, and then take Q&A, or if you jump into Q&A and combine them and you can have a response?
I can give a quick response. Would you like me to?
That'd be perfect. Before you do so, just one very important message that I've been passed by Scott. Apparently the coffee is back on, and the croissants are still fresh. So we're not going to take a break, but if people want to quietly ease out when they think it's an opportune moment, they could. I suspect Scott has some ownership in the catering company. He's pushing us so much, but the coffee is good. I haven't had a croissant yet.
Well, I hope the regulation talk didn't bore people that much. So yeah, just a quick response. This is the first presentation for the paper, so clearly we have a lot of work to do, like not even a ground bag. So I'm super excited to hear everyone's feedback, and especially Ron's huge list of to-dos.
Sorry.
But just quickly,
Tom, excuse me. Parent, I've got to switch the mic over.
Oh, I won't be that long. Yeah, so anyway, quickly just wanted to respond to do the firms with high versus low regulatory exposure differ in important ways? The answer to that question is certainly yes. So smaller firms are more exposed to the regulation. That's part of what the paper's showing. And I totally agree that that will have implication for our analysis of acquired cars and deal activity. Smaller firms would take on fewer deals on average, but would earn higher cars on average. We do control for measures of size and complexity. So hopefully our controls would take care of those issues. And then the other part of that is, compare and acquire with different regulatory beta, but the same sort of target. We do control for deal control, so whether the target is private, public, diversifying in some empirical specifications. Not all, because those are sort of endogenous controls, but in kind of the later columns in the table, we do control for them and find that the results are robust. And then finally, the decline of regulatory beta post-deal, trying to hone in on more direct evidence. I totally agree with you, and everything else on your list we're going to continue to work on, so thank you for that.
Excellent, thank you, Tom. For Q&A, do we have a microphone floating around the room?
We don't. Maybe you can just repeat the question then when it comes.
Okay, excellent, thanks, Scott. So what I asked then, when you present a question, maybe you could just say your name before the question, in the interest of networking and also for those online. And I can't quite see, I'm not as young as I once was, so I also maybe can't see your names. But please.
And I'm thinking here, for instance, about, I think it's Masulis paper, showing an increased cartel enforcement and regulations played a big role in creating M&As as an alternative ways to, obviously increase market power and increase prices. So, and this leads me to a thought that I think it would be really interesting to separate things by which stakeholders the regulations are affecting there. And so separating yours, by regulatory agency, because I think the economic rationale behind these M&As is very different depending on the type of regulation. So for instance, also in line with what Ron was saying, if the regulation, if you're talking about antitrust regulation, cartel regulation, what do you see? And do you see an increase in horizontal M&As? So in this case, I would suspect the bypassing story is supported, and also labor regulation are likely to have a completely different effect. So I think that's something that sounds like it's the first question that comes to my mind, actually.
Thank you. Can we take a few more questions and then we'll group them up? Please.
Okay, hi, my name is William from the University of Portsmouth. So just want to just highlight one point that Ron spoke about. We're just good to understand, how you arrive at your conclusion that, bigger companies, regulatory capture does improve the share, the share price of the companies that we said. And then secondly, just in data, for instance, what challenges do you have in gathering this data for smaller companies? What assumptions do you have to make? Assuming that perhaps, I'm sure you will get perhaps more data that you get for private companies.
Thank you. Please.
I was wondering whether it would make sense to separate firms with positive regulatory exposure versus negative regulatory exposure. And the reason for my question is that when you think about firms with positive regulatory exposure, these are firms that will benefit from more regulation. And then given the general increasing trend of regulations in the US, these firms stand to gain from more regulation. And then, the question becomes, how do we make sense of the result? Can you show that, okay, these high regulatory exposure firms are like to make more acquisitions, more profitable acquisitions, but then these acquisitions tend to reduce their regulatory exposure. So why would they do something to basically belong to their advantage, to benefit from more regulations? So maybe the results you document primarily hold for negative regulatory exposure firms?
Thanks, Faye. Andrey.
Andrey Golubov, University of Toronto. I'm trying to wrap my head around this idea that the cards should be higher and the more exposed to acquirers. And I get the premise that the fixed cost can comply with the regulations, therefore, if you grow, then it's a value increasing action. But that it should be more value increasing than for any other reason to acquire. So presumably, if you're not exposed and you are acquiring, then there's also motivations for that. Why should the regulatory need the most value creative reason to acquire? That's where I'm concerned.
Excellent. Thank you. In the interest of time, maybe I can ask Tom to respond quickly. to the questions. Maybe you can group them by topic.
Yes,
And let me pass.
So, thank you, all great questions. So the first point, there's so many opportunities to work with this data. We can split up different regulatory agencies, and I totally agree that it would be super interesting to split out antitrust versus labor versus environmental. These are things that we can do down the line, and unfortunately, I don't have a good answer now. We have not yet done them. In terms of dealing with private companies, I think Ron's suggestion at creating kind of an industry-level measure of regulatory exposure would be super useful from that perspective, because then we could focus more on the targets in proxy for the level of regulation for private targets using their industry exposure. So thank you for that. Signed, that another fantastic suggestion, signed versus, we currently use absolute value, and we're just trying to say, like, how much does this affect you? But I totally agree with Faye that we can split it up, positive versus negative. So I guess I don't have very many good answers so far, but I'll go with the tough one for the last. Why should cars be higher, or why are regulatory-driven M&A more valuable than other M&A? And I'm just going to rely on my corporate governance background and say that often M&A are empire building and don't have strong economic merits, have negative cars on average for public deals, so at least these deals are driven by something useful for this investment opportunity or these economies of scale to overcome regulation. So thank you for the question. Probably not a little bit of a cop-out answer, but that's the best I could do. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom. I'm sure we'll continue to have conversations over the break later. Eric, would you like to come up and get your slides? And whilst Eric is coming up, can we give a round of applause for Tom and Ron? Thank you. So we've switched to, yes, I'm sure you wanted to know if that works, and your slides are up.
I have to keep it.
There's a little clip. It's just,
Okay. That's better. Just right. Is it good? Yes? Good enough? Higher?
yeah, if you just put it on your...
The shot. Maybe that way? Okay,
Yep.
that's better.
I think that's great.
Perfect, thanks.
Okay, again, it's 20 minutes for the presentation, 15 for discussion, 10 for Q&A.
I will try to stick to it.
Had a very quick exodus for coffee and croissants, but hopefully people will return.
Okay, first of all, I would really like to thank the organizer for putting us on the program. I really enjoyed this opportunity to present a paper face-to-face. It's only the second time in 3 years now, so it's really an experience for me to see people live in front of me. Also, it will be a reality check for me because I had, I was really afraid to lose completely my English during that long period. So I have a strategy to try to keep it. It was a 15-minute Netflix a day, and we will see whether it has been efficient enough or not. So it's a joint work with Micah, who is in the room just over there, with Jean-Gabriel Cousin and Richard Troll, who I'm working since many years now. You will see, in a sense, it's a simple paper with a simple research question. I think the method is quite straightforward. There are only 2 specificities in the method, and we believe that 2 specificities make the difference. So I will just try to convince you about that. So the research question is, do Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission, so regulatory activities, intervention in the M&A market, deter future M&A transaction? By deterrence, we mean current enforcement have a negative impact on future M&A activity. It may appear to be, in some sense, a strange question, so maybe I find it's worthwhile to go a little bit into the background of that story and to go back to the mission statement of the Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission. So I'm just quoting them. The Bureau of Competition is committed to preventing merger and acquisition that are likely to reduce competition and lead to higher price, lower quality of goods and services, and less innovation. It appears to be clear, quite straightforward. The goal is just to protect the consumer by avoiding anti-competitive acquisition. There is long-standing roots in the legal framework of that story. It goes up to the Sherman Act and the Clayton Act. It's beginning of the 20th century, end of the 19th century. Also, there is ample international evidence that regulating the M&A market has a strong political support. So politicians apparently really think it's important to implement such regulation in time and around the world. I just mentioning the case of the European Union Directorate General of Competition, which has a specialized M&A team, but it's also the case in Japan and so on and so forth. So, quite surprisingly and in stark contrast with this political belief that regulation is necessary, if you go into what I call the early finance academic literature, you will find this paper by Espen-Egbo from 83, 85, 92, and the main conclusion of these papers I read 20 years ago, long times ago, is that after all, looking to the capital market evidence, so he's focusing on rival returns, there isn't that much, not to say there isn't at all, market power creation due to M&A activity. And even in 92, when he's comparing the US evidence with the Canadian evidence, he concludes, in fact, there is nothing to detail. So don't talk about deterrence effect if there is nothing to detail. I have had many discussions with him about this conclusion. I always have been puzzled by such kind of strong statement. I really think he's still convinced of that. There is not that much reason why we should regulate the M&A market. It's true that even in the early evidence, there are some papers indicating that in some specific industries, M&A activity may reinforce market power. It's a case in the airline industries, in the banking industries. We have, during the year 2000, two quite influential papers studying the upstream and downstream effect of M&A activities and showing that there is some wealth transfer from the upstream to the downstream to consumers, but this doesn't really justify regulating M&A activity in itself. And so it remains, why do we spend so much money to supervise the M&A activity with regulatory bodies that are quite expensive if there is nothing really to regulate? There is a new stream of paper, and I think that this is the stream of paper to which we contribute, that display more recent evidence that after all, it might make sense to regulate M&A activities. I just mentioned the fourth one I find the more relevant. There's a paper by Cloterkey and Sank. It's more about acquisition in the US by foreign acquirer, and there they clearly show that there is a deterrence effect, but it might be related to the CFIUS committee activity and this protection of US assets by this regulatory body. There is a nice new paper by Jarrett showing that in highly concentrated industry with quite high product similarity level, there might be anti-competitive effect of merger and acquisition. There is a paper called Killer Acquisition from Memory that shows in the pharmaceutical industry acquired tends to acquire small startups to kill new drugs and to avoid to have to compete against this drug. There's also a new paper by Kepler and all. They are talking about stealth acquisitions, and the idea is that acquirers try to organize and structure the transaction in such a way they don't undergo the regulatory investigation. So we try, in fact, to contribute. I think that we contribute to that stream of literature, and this new evidence is more supportive of the need of some kind of regulation. What is the mechanism we have in mind? It's the one you mentioned. It's uncertainty, and indeed there are a set of papers showing, again by Jared, that the economic uncertainty matters, but also political, public, and source of uncertainty are important when we try to understand what is driving M&A activity. We more focus on another source of uncertainty, which is regulatory uncertainty, and I will try to show to you that it plays a role in the present case. I guess most of you in the room knows the procedure that the Department of Justice and Federal Trade Commission are following to investigate transaction. It's quite a long procedure, a two-step procedure. There is a pre-merger notification step, then there is a 30 days delays. If the Department of Justice of the Federal Trade Commission want to investigate more the deal, they will require more information. There is a time to transmit this information. Next, there is again a 30 days delay. No, it can really last months, okay? And it's clear that for the merging parties having to bargain with the regulatory authorities during months, it's a huge source of uncertainty. So it's a long and complex procedure. I will insist on the fact that it's a predictive by nature procedure, and it's really a problem because the guys at the FTC and Department of Justice have to try to figure out what will be the industry in case of transaction and in absence of transaction, and to make the difference between the two. And you know, it's really a predictive game. It's not at all easy to do. It's characterized by significant information asymmetry between the merging parties who knows far better than the regulator their own activities and the regulator. There is plenty of room for subjectivity, not to say for political interferences. And so it's clear that it generates, in fact, for merging parties and for rivals of merging parties, a lot of uncertainty. I like to mention just one funny case, is the Sprint T-Mobile merger that was blocked by the US regulators in 2040, but authorized in 2080. And in fact, it's the same transaction. So it shows you that political interference may play a role here. What is our research design? I have 10 minutes left, so I will be fast. It's just a schematic equation. It's not really an equation, a schematic equation. On the left-hand side, we will have the probability to observe a transaction or attempt on a given target, and on the right-hand side, you will have some indicator variable that pick enforcement attempt by the regulatory authorities. The two key ingredients, and I will just insist on that for the econometric implementation, the two key ingredients of our method is that we use the Oberg and Phillips similarity scores to identify the equivalent or the proxy of the relevant market, okay, for the merging parties, and we select the 10 nearest neighbors in the product market space. And the second, I will just display that but explain it, the second very specific element of our method is that we don't work at the firm level, we work at the cluster level. What does it mean? Is that each firm has a cluster of 10 nearest neighbors in the product market space. We create a large panel of cluster year observation over 20 years. It's depending on the test we do between 50,000 to 70,000 cluster year observation in panel. And then we will identify the intensity or the frequency of M&A activity in cluster. That's the probability of acquisition, the left-hand side variable, and we will identify all cluster years that are impacted by an enforcement due to the regulator. This is the key of the method, because it means that instead of having a few hundred in first enforcement, we have between 1,500 to 2,000 cluster years that are impacted by enforcement procedure. So this is the left-hand side variable, the probability of acquisition. This is the right-hand side variable, the dummies that are picking in enforcement. I skip just the discussion of the econometric specification and the endogeneity. We fully acknowledge that we are exposed to source of endogeneity. We don't believe this is too much of an issue due to the research question, but we try to convince the reader about that. And I will just start with our sample. We have 100,000 firm years. Okay, this is the Hobert and Phillips universe. The number of listed firms is decreasing through time. That's the classic US listing gap phenomenon we all know now. We track average similarity score through time. It's interesting to know that it's in fact increasing through time. I don't think that it's many people are well aware of that. We hand collect in the report, to the annual report to the Congress, the enforcement by the US regulatory activities. It's 470 enforcement. Then we have a large sample of M&A transaction, and we match by hand, one by one, this enforcement to the merger and acquisition collected in the SDC database. So nothing really specific from that point of view. Just maybe I will emphasize one descriptive statistic is the first one. So this descriptive statistic is by cluster year. So it means that .03, it's 3% of enforcement case by cluster year. But as I told you, we have 50,000 to 70,000 cluster years, so 3% is between 1,500 to 2,100 cluster years that are impacted by enforcement attempt. Let's keep in the interest of time this. We have a long list of controls, as you might guess it. We windsorize all ratio, and the baseline result is that one. So, yes, I have the pointer. So you see that when we regress here, the probability to observe an M&A attempt in a given cluster year on past enforced, oops, I lost the, okay, on past enforcement, here is a dummy variable, but we do it for 1 year, we do it for 3 years with control variable, without control variable. We get a negative sign that is highly statistically significant and economic significant. That .008 coefficient, minus .008 coefficient, means a decrease by 15% of M&A activity with respect to the unconditional average, 15%. So it's not nothing. And it's long-lasting. We get it over up to 3 years, and it's still highly significant 3 years after. I prefer to spend the 4 minutes that I have in front of me on evidence backing the mechanism. Okay, so I will really be fast. It works with enforcement, withdrawal, rejection. Okay. It works if we control for cross-cluster correlation thanks to two-way standard error clustered by cluster and year. It's robust to the well-known Goodman and Bacon decomposition, and so on and so forth. So I really think we have a placebo test Or let me just focus on one additional test I like a lot. It's thanks to Tintin, who is sitting in the room. She provides us a fantastic alternative industry classification. It's valuation spear. It's collected by hand. She will describe that incredible data set she collected by hand. It's really valuation peers for thousands of M&A transactions. And the good news for us and for her, I think so, is that it works well, even with this alternative definition of, rivals. It's a good news for us because it divides by 2 our sample, and despite of that, everything is significant and still there. And I think it's a good news for her because it shows that the valuation spear she's picking are really rivals of the firms. We replicate the result with 3-digit SIC code. Most results then disappear. And it's interesting to see because it might explain why previous war didn't pick what we obtained. And finally, it works with horizontal M&A. It works with the intensive match. Let's focus on the mechanism for 2 minutes left. So our argument is that it's due to uncertainty, and we try to test that with the idea that the longer the procedure, the enforcement procedure, the more there's discussion and bargaining between the merging parties and the regularity authorities, the more it creates uncertainty. And we test this idea by adding to the specification an interaction term between hand-collected duration of enforcement procedure and the fact that there is an enforcement. And what do we get? We get the fact that this interaction term has a negative and strongly significant coefficient. So this is not direct evidence of the role of uncertainty, but it's consistent with uncertainty playing a role. Another test we do is we check what is the impact of the enforcement procedure on pending transaction in the cluster. And again, our hypothesis is that consistently with the role of uncertainty for the ones who are currently negotiating a merger, if uncertainty play a role, it should last longer to complete the transaction, and it's exactly what we get. The time to completion increase for pending transaction in case of enforcement in the industry. Lastly, and this will be the last result I will show, I think I will keep the 20 minutes target. One thing that is interesting also, we have a regression-based version of these graphics, but is to study acquisition size, okay, depending on whether there is an enforcement or there isn't an enforcement. So the upper panel is no enforcement case, and the lower panel is enforcement case. And both histograms are the distribution of the frequency of transaction just below the reporting threshold, the notification threshold. And what's really great to see, even if it's small sample, is to see that there's a clear shift to the right between the upper panel and the lower panel that shows you that in fact there are far more transactions that will be just below the reporting threshold in case of enforcement in the. Again, I think it's quite supporting the main results we provide in the paper. In the interest of time, I will skip the conclusion and then cite you a lot. Microphone.
Thanks, Eric. Excellent. I especially like the last graph. The discussant is Andrey. So, Andrey, can I pass you the baton, so to speak? Thank you.
Okay, let's I'm going to make sure I do full screen for you. Let's see if that helps. Great. Well, thank you very much to organizers for having me discuss this paper. It's always a pleasure to be back at my original institution. I used to work here for a number of years, and I always am very happy to come back and see familiar faces and old friends. So the paper I will discuss is titled Unintended Consequences of M&A Regulatory Enforcements. I hope my discussion will not engender any unintended consequences for me. So let me try to spend a bit of time on what the paper does and also try to position it in the literature. There's lots of things that the authors do in this paper. Eric couldn't present everything in his presentation, so let me try to wrap it up. So the paper examines the effect of antitrust enforcements on M&A deals and whether those enforcements effectively deter future M&A attempts. Right? So when the regulator intervenes today, are future M&A less likely or not? And so what the paper shows is that, yes, indeed, this is the case. When the two major competition authorities in the US, DOJ and FTC, when they intervene on deals today, future deals in the same industry, and the authors are very clever in how they define an industry, those are less likely in the future. And especially so when the focal intervention is lengthy. On top of that, transactions which are currently outstanding in the same cluster take longer to complete, and any future deals that do materialize in that cluster tend to be smaller. And so the authors conclude that indeed those interventions by the competition authorities deter future M&A activity, and they conclude that the mechanism through which that happens is uncertainty about future enforcement. So we're now more uncertain about the future intervention, and therefore we don't do deals as often. So let me try to spend some time on the paper's strengths. They say whenever you have feedback, always start with the positives. So I start with the positives. It's a very timely topic. There's increasing interest in the role of M&A regulators, whether they're too lax or not, especially in the US. The paper is methodologically very competent. I mentioned very clever use of product market peers, data from Harburg and Phillips. The authors are aware of the advancements in the diff and diff literature and implement those tests as well. The paper is very rich in robustness checks. It is very well written. I think it wouldn't be a mistake to say that the combined paper writing experience of the four authors of this paper is close to 100 years. So no pressure for the discussant. So here are my main comments. First of all, I would like us to be clear about what the paper does and what the literature has done before. So the big picture here is when the government opposes deals, for whatever reasons, there's less M&A deals in the future. And I think that result is fairly well established in the literature. So if you take just general forms of opposition, a good example I like to cite is this paper that's called Economic Nationalism in M&A. Whenever governments oppose deals, future deals in the same country are less likely to be attempted. And then we can go from the general to the more specific, so from general forms of opposition to opposition on specifically competition concerns. Again, the authors are very honest in citing previous work, and that we know that it seems to be the case, that yes, indeed, when the government intervenes on competition grounds, future deals are less likely. Eric mentioned Espen Egbau's work as giving some conflicting evidence on that hypothesis. I think Espen does slightly different in his paper. So when Espen talks about deterrence in his work, it's not whether future M&A is less likely, it's whether the intervention deters the truly anti-competitive deals. So are they intervening on the bad deals, on the ones which should be intervened on? And his answer is no. And so I think the deterrence in his paper is slightly different from what the authors have in mind. So with this general picture, I think it's fair to say that, and the authors themselves refer to their evidence as sort of an update in the more recent regulatory framework. We know that the DOJ, FTC have been revising their guidelines. Concentration has been changing, and so it's good to know that indeed in the new environment that deterrence effect seems to be still there. At the same time, ideally, I would like to push the authors to give us more insights on why this is happening. I think really the mechanism as to why when the DOJ or FTC intervene, future deals are less likely, I actually think that the answer is not that obvious. And I think the authors can probably shed some more light on that. So let me get into the mechanism. So as I said, I'm convinced that when the government intervenes on deals today, future deals are less likely. But it's not at all obvious to me why that happens. It seems that this is a straightforward thing, but I don't think it actually is that simple. So the authors conclude that the culprit here is uncertainty. So if a government intervenes today, that raises our uncertainty about the likelihood of a future intervention, and because we don't like uncertainty, we don't do it. Right? I think that's more or less what the authors have in mind. I think the paper could be a little bit more rigorous in terms of defining uncertainty up front, exactly what that is. And I will be very clear about how I think we generally think about uncertainty. Some of the proxies that they use for uncertainty, somewhat indirect, I would say. Length is time, it's duration. Duration is not uncertainty, it's duration. So I will leave that with you to think about those proxies and whether you find them convincing. Let me try to dig down to the very basics of what uncertainty really means and what we mean by uncertainty and whether it's the same thing that the authors mean by uncertainty. And in general, what could an enforcement action represent? So typically when we talk about uncertainty, we talk about risk or the spread of the distribution, right? There's the first moment, the mean or the expected value of the distribution, what's the expected likelihood of the government intervening, and there is the variance, that's the uncertainty, right? So a future intervention might come from a distribution with a mean of 10% and a variance of, let's say, 10%, right? And so when we say higher uncertainty, it's higher variance of that distribution. I think that's how economists typically think of uncertainty, right? And so the first moment is the regulator is expected to be tougher, right? If the government intervenes today, it means that the regulator is shifting its regime into a tougher stance, higher likelihood of intervention in the future. The second moment is there's higher variance around the same constant expected mean, right? So we are more uncertain as to whether an intervention will come or not. And I'm going to argue that in the distribution of the shape that it is, it's very hard. I don't know how to distinguish the first and the second moment because the distribution of the probability of intervention here is a truncated distribution. It's truncated at 0. It's akin to a log normal distribution. And so what happens to the mean of a truncated distribution, such as a log normal distribution, when you increase its variance and keep truncating at 0? Well, it's shown here. So basically, here I've drawn realizations from the distribution with a mean of 10 and a standard deviation of 10% as well. Here, I keep the mean constant, I increase the variance, and I keep truncating at 0. And guess what? The mean also shifts. That's just it's just the reality of a truncated distribution. So when the variance increases, the mean and the expected likelihood of intervention also goes up. And so it's very hard to disentangle the first moment effect and the uncertainty effect, which is the second moment effect. Now, on top of that, what else could an enforcement action represent? So when the FTC and DOJ intervene today, apart from signaling a tougher stance or higher uncertainty about future intervention, on top of that, it could also be the case that, as the authors acknowledge, they intervene for a reason. And such reason could be that perhaps this industry cluster has reached its capacity for deals. It's gotten so concentrated that now the government has to step in and say no. And so what that means is that the government intervenes, and if that's the reason they do so, they will intervene in the future, for sure, right? And so what that means is that an intervention today effectively signals a higher likelihood of intervention tomorrow, but not because the government is getting tougher per se. It's because the industry has reached a point at which it's just going to happen. So that's the third interpretation of what an intervention today could mean, on top of the first and the second moment effect. And I think there's also at least a fourth, and maybe there's more. Regulators intervene in case of large, audacious deals, right? Is it possible that firms attempt these audacious deals only every once in a while? Or it's only every so often. So could it be a mean reverting process? And so if they do it this year and the government intervenes, it's less likely that next time around the same audacious deal will be attempted, simply because there are only a few of those available. And the authors are aware of this concern. They do try to control for the potentially mean reverting nature of M&A activity in general, not just large M&A. And here's where I had some questions about some of the econometrics. I'm sorry for getting into the more boring and nitty-gritty parts of the paper. The authors have their baseline results. They're here at the top. Then they implement the so-called Arellano bond estimator, which is effectively controlling for past M&A activity for the lag of the dependent variable. And I'm not sure. I think the coefficients from these two analyses should be comparable in magnitude. And if they are, something seems strange, because the main effect goes up by a factor of 4 or 5. And so my question to the authors is, which specification do we prefer? Because if this is really the right specification, then you're underestimating the main effect by a factor of 4 or 5. And that would be an important thing to point out. So is the effect really that large? Maybe if it is, it's good to know. Or maybe there is something in the specification that is strange. I noticed that the standard errors are also blowing up, so something to think about there. I really like this use of firm-specific clusters. Really smart of the authors to build these individual firm-specific industries. The trouble with that is that because a firm can be a peer to many other firms in its cluster, enforcements against any given firm are going to show up many times in the sample, are going to show up in many different clusters. So the explanatory variable and likely the residuals are for sure by construction correlated. And so you will have a certain correlation and an issue with the standard errors, not at the cluster level, but at the enforcement level, right? So a given enforcement affects different clusters. And so ideally what you want to do is cluster standard errors by an enforcement, but you really can't, because only 3% of the clusters are affected by an enforcement. Others are not. And so maybe bunch them all together into one cluster. I don't know. That's one option, but there's certainly some correlation going on, I think. On a related note, clusters are fluid over time because peers change, and so it wasn't obvious to me what the authors mean when they say we cluster standard errors by cluster. Sorry for the tautology there, because a cluster changes. So a cluster today is not the same cluster tomorrow. So what does it mean to cluster by that unit? Similarly, double clustering by time seems to be important, seems to bring down statistical significance, maybe be conservative and use that as a baseline. Something else that stood out to me is the fact that the stacked regression approach, which is arguably the right approach if we believe that the recent literature on diff and diff estimators, that result here seems to be on the weaker side. These are 90% confidence intervals here, so it looks like the effect is fairly weak, unless I'm misinterpreting how this graph is put together. And a couple of final points. When you randomize enforcements across clusters, don't just do one randomization, because by luck you can get into a randomization where nothing holds anymore. Do 1,000 of those randomizations to see whether indeed, when you properly do a Monte Carlo simulation, the effect indeed disappears, because you can always get lucky and get one where it disappears by luck. And I think in general, something that I'm guilty of myself, probably we're all guilty in academia, is we tend to make grand statements. So one grand statement that I picked up here is that regulation hampers efficient resource allocation. Well, probably, but we don't observe the deals which are being deterred, therefore we don't know if they would have been efficient or not. So that's basically all I had to say. My slides are misbehaving. This was my conclusion slide. And my conclusion was that I think I'm fairly convinced that the deterrence effect is there. I'm not at all sure why it happens. And I think it's not trivial to figure that out. If the authors can do it, I think they will really elevate the contribution of the paper. And I look forward to seeing all 7 papers from this program published in leading journals, and this one as well. Thank you very much.
Eric, would you like to come up and provide a response? Thanks, Andrey.
Thanks a lot for this really great discussion. I have sadly to acknowledge that it's probably more than 100 years. That starts to be a bad news for us, but that's what it is. About the mechanism, you are perfectly right. In fact, there is the notion of this notion of uncertainty is more ambiguous than we might think at first sight, because there is a question, is there more certainty of future enforcement, of more uncertainty about the enforcement outcome? And we are not clear enough in the paper at its stance, and I think that probably we have to do more on that side, on the mechanism, and whether what's driving the results is whether future acquisition attempts will be blocked, or whether the outcome of the current enforcement procedure generates uncertainty, and it's hard to anticipate. So this must certainly be clarified. I like a lot, because you know my taste for applied econometric issue. I liked a lot your puzzling comment about the first and second moment issue. I have to admit I didn't think about it at all, so I have to think about it. About the fact, and finally, the last, it's not a response, a comment about whether it's a good thing that there is a deterrence effect or not, and whether this future transaction would have been potentially efficient or not. We have nothing to do about that, and it's fair enough. We have to be very careful in writing that we have no stance about whether it's a good or a bad thing. The question is whether there is or not a deterrence effect. So thanks a lot for the comments.
Thank you, Eric. I realise we're over, but maybe we can still take a few questions, because I do think it's a very nice paper and deserves to receive such questions. So any questions from the audience? Please. Again, sorry, name and...
Alan Giles from Bayes Business School, but I'm not an academic, but I was on the board of the UK Antitrust Authority for 11 years. So just one thing you might think about is why a merger control authority will change its basis of intervention over time. And I think in my experience there are 3 reasons that can happen. Firstly is that the industry itself becomes more concentrated. So the authority might be happy to allow 5 participants to reduce to 4, but would be unhappy for 4 participants to reduce to 3. That's a relatively straightforward thing. Secondly, though, the authority may change its approach because it has developed novel theories of harm, or there have been new analytical methods or factors that have come into play. So, for example, in the last 10 years, the authorities focus on the use of data as a basis of potential consumer harm would have gone greatly, would have increased greatly. And then the third thing, which is the most complex factor here, is, I think, political and public interest issues coming into play, which are over and beyond pure competition. And that's definitely been a trend in the US, the UK, and in Europe. So I think you just might want to think about those 3 different drivers of changed behaviour on the part of the merger control authority.
Thank you, Alan. Please.
I was wondering if you try a variety of different nearest neighbour sizes, specifically like really concentrated industries, if you get to a sample size of 10, you might have particularly distant neighbours, because you specifically talked about like the Sprint T-Mobile merger, right? And there's really only 4 participants in that industry. So if I do a nearest neighbours of 10, who are those other 6? So thinking about trying different sizes when you're doing those nearest neighbours.
Very good. Do we have any more questions? Eric, would you like to take the opportunity to address those 2 very different questions briefly?
So first, thanks for the comments. I think you are fully right, and it's interesting to see, for example, in the 2010 US merger guidelines, horizontal merger guidelines, to see that there is a new focus on innovation, for example, that wasn't that present before in the 97 guidelines. And this is quite well emphasized in a chapter of a book by Shapiro. It's very interesting to see because, indeed, it changed the way transactions are analyzed and are challenged, or the reason why they are challenged. So maybe we have to do more about that, and we could maybe split the period depending a little bit on the kind of drivers that are driving, that's the case to say, the enforcement procedure. But that's true. It's not constant through time. It changes. About the size of the industry, we report some robustness check in the paper with TNIC, with think tank, valuation peers. In this case, the size of the industry is varying. Depending on the transaction, it's not anymore fixed. Our results are mostly robust to that. We don't report it, we did do it with a cluster of 20 firms. We get almost the same results, it doesn't matter. If you know a little bit about the similarity scores, in fact, if you rank firms in the product market space by similarity scores, there are a lot of similarity scores that are very close to each other, you know. And so when you take the 10 first, it doesn't mean that there is a clear gap with the 11th or the 12th one. And so if you play a little bit on this kind of threshold, it doesn't change a lot of things.
Thank you, Eric. Well, I hope you all agree that was a great start to the conference. I think it was 2 great papers. So it's just for me to ask you all to give a round of applause to Tom, Ron, Eric, and Andrey.